After the booms and bangs of a 4th of July fireworks show faded, and residents of Robins Air Force Base in Georgia tucked themselves into bed, one airman stalked his prey through the base, crawling behind bushes and trees, trying to get close without being seen. His camouflaged uniform kept him concealed until the last moment, when he drew his knife and let himself into his friend's home. This is Conduct Unbecoming. I'm Erin, and I'm your host. In mid-March 2004, Senior Airman Andrew Witt, an avionics technician with the 116th Air Control Wing, took his motorcycle out for a ride. Witt, while on this ride, crashed. He lost consciousness and sustained a closed head injury. Doctors suspected but couldn't confirm that the impact resulted in a traumatic brain injury. However, a CT scan at the time was unremarkable and didn't demonstrate any signs of serious injury. He was hospitalized for a short while and was later released to go home. Months after the accident, his roommate said he'd observed a change in his behavior. He said he'd noticed that Witt became more outspoken about things after the accident. He said Witt didn't put up with anything anymore and that, for the first time, he witnessed Witt get into a fight. Now, during this time, Witt was still in his first assignment at Robins Air Force Base in Georgia. He joined the Air Force on November 27, 2001. Months later, on the 3rd of July 2004, which was a Saturday, Senior Airman Andrew Schleipzig, who went by Andy, and his wife Jamie hosted Senior Airman King in their home, a regular occurrence as the Kings and the Schleipzigs were friends. While King visited, Senior Airman Andrew Witt called the Schleipzigs and asked if he could come over too. Because there are two Andrews in today's case, I'll refer to Andrew Schleipzig as Andy and Andrew Witt as Witt. King went home and to bed with a headache at some point, and later, when it was just Jamie and Witt in a room together, Witt made an unwelcome sexual advance. Witt tried to kiss Jamie. Nothing happened between them. Jamie stopped him in time. Later, Witt returned home without incident. The next day, Sunday, the 4th of July 2004, Andy and his wife Jamie arrived at the home of Senior Airman King. Andy and King both wore red shirts to celebrate the holiday. King and his wife lived on Warner Robins Air Force Base, which is about 18 miles south-southeast of Macon, Georgia. They were all going to celebrate the holiday together, and doing it on base is wildly patriotic. Mrs. King went to sleep at around 1 a.m. on the 5th of July. At some point after that, Jamie disclosed to her husband and to Senior Airman King what Witt did the evening before, on the 3rd of July, that he'd tried to kiss her without her consent. At this point, it was late, and everyone very likely had been drinking. The disclosure upset Andy, and he called Witt to confront him at 1:37 a.m. They spoke twice more, and 9 calls, I believe from Andy, went unanswered. These calls were heated. Sometimes Witt said he was sorry, and sometimes Witt told King and Andy to come over and fight him. The last time Andy dialed over to Witt was 2:12 a.m. At 2:21 a.m. on the 5th of July, Witt called Andy, and the two spoke for 33 minutes. In that 49-minute period between when the calls from Andy started and when Witt called back at 2:21, Witt had changed into his battle dress uniform, something I like to refer to as their cami jammies. He told his roommate that he was changing into his uniform so, quote, they wouldn't see him. He told his roommate the overview of what was going on, that Andy threatened him. Witt said Andy planned on getting him in trouble. He said that Andy planned to make a big deal of the attempted kiss, and that he would reveal an alleged affair that Witt was having with an officer's wife. There isn't more information about this alleged affair with an officer's wife, but clearly this was an allegation that upset Witt. He planned to observe the trio that confronted him, to find out what was going on their side of things. After dressing in his uniform, he retrieved a knife from his closet and stashed it in the trunk of his car. Witt climbed into the driver's seat and set off to Robins Air Force Base. He arrived at the gate at approximately 3:15 a.m., over an hour after the phone calls started. The camouflage uniform wouldn't have stood out to the gate guard. People wear camouflage on base literally every day. Witt parked his car approximately 50 yards from the King house. He left the car, grabbed the knife from his trunk, crept behind the foliage, and watched. At approximately 4 a.m., the trio of friends drove a quarter-mile down the road to the Schleipzig house to pick up some cigarettes. Witt followed on foot. When the trio were inside the home, King and Jamie spoke by phone with a friend who lived in Virginia. While they spoke to that friend, Witt opened the door to the Schleipzig home and let himself in. He found Andy alone in the kitchen. Andy yelled at Witt to get out, to leave his house. Witt looked past Andy to the bedroom where King and Jamie spoke on the phone and said, "Oh good, you're here too." Witt and Andy then got into a physical fight. King came in to where Andy and Witt were scuffling and put Witt in a headlock, trying to pull him off of Andy. He was successful, and Andy got away and retreated into the living room. King let Witt out of the headlock and told him he had to leave, that he just didn't belong there. He asked him why he didn't just leave. In that moment, 2 hours after the confrontation began, Witt had to choose: walk away from this fight or finish what he started. Witt unsheathed his knife and stabbed King in the chest, puncturing his left lung. King screamed out, warning his friends he's got a knife, as he turned to run. He didn't get far before Witt caught up and stabbed him again in the back. Jamie yelled out, "Oh my God, you're bleeding," then ran to a bedroom and locked herself in. Locked in that room, she couldn't know what was happening in the rest of the house. She couldn't know when it might be safe to escape. She couldn't know what was happening to her friend King or to her husband. King, reeling from this second stab wound, got away from Witt and ran towards the door, but he got slowed down by a deadbolt. Witt stabbed King again before King was able to slip outside. Once outside, he ran. Witt chased after him, determined to finish what he started, but King got to a neighbor's house where he sought help. Witt had stabbed King a total of 4 times and caught King's arm in a slicing motion. One of these stabs cut the splenic artery, an artery that supplies blood to the spleen. For those wondering where the spleen is, as Beyoncé said, it's to the left, to the left. One of Witt's other stabs wounded King's kidney. Then Witt returned to the Schleipzig home. He didn't want to leave any evidence or witnesses. There, Witt discovered Andy on the phone with emergency services. Jamie was hiding in the back bedroom, hiding from the chaotic scene unfolding in her home. Witt prioritized going after Jamie, and he kicked the door a few times before using his shoulder to break through. Inside, Jamie was hiding behind the door in the fetal position. Witt broke her arm and stabbed her a total of 5 times. The majority of Jamie's stab wounds were to her back and her side, as she struggled to stay in a protective fetal position. One stab cut through her diaphragm, collapsed her left lung, and punctured her spleen. A second wound entered the side of her body and into her abdomen, again injuring her spleen. A third wound to her lower back hit her liver and a kidney. Her fourth wound, to the right side of her back, collapsed her right lung. A separate incise or slash wound cut into her 6th, 7th, and 8th ribs. Her 5th and final stab wound pierced beneath her right armpit. Together, these 5 stabs proved fatal. And Witt still had one witness left to deal with, Andy himself. It didn't matter to Witt that Andy had already called for emergency assistance, or that the neighbors King sought safety with also called for help. Witt stabbed him first in the left side of his back. The knife punctured Andy's diaphragm and entered his liver. The second wound cut through Andy's thoracic vertebrae, severing his spinal cord. This second wound instantly paralyzed Andy from the upper waist down. In the final moments of Senior Airman Andy Schleipzig's life, Witt turned him over and stabbed him in the chest. This final wound immediately killed Andy because it pierced through his heart. Witt left the residence. Emergency services hadn't yet shown up. He ditched the knife, his uniform cover, or hat, as civilians would call it, and his boots. I don't know why, but it strikes me that Witt was so committed to showing up in the proper uniform that he wore his cover in the dead of night, while sneaking around a friend's home, preparing to murder him. Shortly after Witt fled the scene, responding emergency personnel discovered 2 bodies in the on-base house at 1152A Fort Valley Street. They'd found Andy dead, lying on his back in the living room, and they found Jamie approximately 10 feet away. First responders rushed King to the hospital and into emergency surgery to begin to repair the damage to the splenic artery and his kidney. He initially spent 15 days in the hospital, returning 4 or 5 times for follow-up surgeries. In total, Senior Airman King spent more than 30 days in the hospital recovering from his injuries. And Senior Airman Witt initially just went about his life. On the 5th of July, hours after the murders, he called his friends and made plans to meet for lunch, dinner, and drinks. During the day, Witt made a comment to his roommate that after the confrontation and conversations in the early morning hours, Andy didn't want to be friends anymore. As they drove past the scene of the crime where he'd brutally murdered 2 people and attempted to kill another, Witt told his roommate that, "I can't be here. I have to go." Air Force Office of Special Investigations agents apprehended Witt as he drove back to the scene with a friend. When they questioned him, Witt maintained that he was at home at his off-base apartment on the evening of July 4th and the morning hours of July 5th. Agents confronted him with the video evidence of him entering the base, and that's when he changed his story to say that he was on base, but he wasn't at the Schleipzigs' home. Eventually, he confessed in both verbal and written statements, and described the orders of his attacks, and details that only the murderer could know. He described his state of mind at the time of the murders as euphoric or drunken. Witt eventually led special agents to the knife, his cover, and his boots, and they were covered in blood. The knife carried red fibers consistent with the shirts that both King and Andy wore on the 4th of July. After his arrest and after charges were preferred, Witt attended his Article 32 hearing. This preliminary hearing, in an unusual turn, took place off base at the local courthouse. The Article 32 preliminary hearing takes place after preferral and is most comparable to a grand jury proceeding. A preliminary hearing officer, or FO, examines all of the charges preferred against an accused before the case is referred to a general court-martial. At the hearing, Witt saw the crime scene evidence for the first time and began to cry. A local deputy sheriff consoled Witt, and the defense mitigation specialist recommended getting contact information in order to potentially call that deputy sheriff as a witness to speak about Witt's remorse. The deputy sheriff said that she believed Witt to be a broken young man in great pain and despair. After he left the courtroom in tears, she wrapped her arms around him to give him a hug and offer him comfort and spiritual guidance. She whispered words of encouragement to him and reminded him that God loved him, that she loved him, and that he was walking with God. The deputy sheriff shared that this incident was only the second time that she comforted someone in distress at their hearing, and believed that they were truly remorseful. "She seems like a much stronger woman than I am, because I don't think I could go wrap my arms around someone in a hug who'd brutally stabbed 2 of his friends to death and proceeded to make lunch plans hours after washing their blood from his hands." Over the course of his pretrial confinement, Witt wrote to friends about how he was doing and how he was feeling about the upcoming trial. He bemoaned that for this, his first infraction, he had to jump straight to hard time in prison. He said it just wasn't fair, that he wasn't a hellion, and facing this unfair punishment meant he didn't know how he could ever trust God or anyone else again. He told his friends that he'd been doing well until he, quote, got manipulated into this situation. And I got stuck on this idea that he expressed, that he was manipulated into this, quote, situation. I have tried very hard to think about this statement with empathy, but I keep concluding that Witt was the architect of his own downfall. He was the one with violence on the brain. He was the one that suggested that both Andy and King come fight him. Given the admissions that Witt made throughout the course of the investigation, the case was not a question of who committed the crimes, but rather, why? And there is no satisfying explanation in the appellate record. The most concrete explanation that I found was that Andrew Witt murdered 2 people and nearly murdered a third as a self-serving attempt to protect his ego. There were a lot of references made to Witt's mental health throughout his trial and his sentencing phase. One doctor testified that he believed Witt had schizoid and borderline traits, then, later in his testimony, changed these to paranoid and borderline traits. Another doctor testified to the effects that adrenaline has on both impulse control and judgment. Some, but not much, attention was given to Witt's motorcycle accident, and the claim that his behavior shifted as he recovered. There was also the issue of his mother's previous 17-day hospitalization at an inpatient mental health facility for depression. Witt was in 8th grade when his mother left for treatment. His father used alcohol and drugs and physically abused his mother. Perhaps, some believed, this information could explain Witt's decision-making and who he became as an adult. And there is a lot of data about how adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, impact who we become as adults. ACE scores range from 0 to 10, and, for a bit of additional context, 64% of people in America have an ACE score of 1. The more ACEs you have, the greater your risk is for chronic disease, mental illness, violence, and being a victim of violence. Witt would probably answer yes to the question regarding whether the maternal figure in his life was physically abused, yes to the question about living with a problem drinker, and yes to the question about family members who were depressed or mentally ill. This gives an ACE score of at least 3. I'll include a link in the show notes to the ACE survey for those who are interested in learning more. As interesting as I find the data on adverse childhood experiences, defense counsel did not delve further into these ACEs. The contested court-martial began in September 2005 and was held, again, off-base at the Bibb County Courthouse in Macon, Georgia. Andrew Witt had 3 defense counsel working on his case. The lead counsel was a civilian trial defense counsel with no previous experiences defending capital murder cases, but with extensive experience defending military cases. Military members are entitled to military defense counsel for free, but they are not entitled to civilian defense counsel for free. If an accused chooses to hire civilian defense counsel, they must hire and pay for them themselves. And even if they do hire civilian defense counsel, their military defense counsel remain on the case. And circling back to the defense counsel claim that the physical effects of adrenaline impaired Witt's ability to premeditate his murderous attack, they asserted that the effects of adrenaline clouded Witt's judgment. And maybe Witt did experience a surge of adrenaline in the first few calls when Andy called to confront him about hitting on his wife. It's estimated that adrenaline can last in the system up to an hour after you've been removed from the stressful situation. But the surge of adrenaline from being confronted was an hour before Witt arrived at the base. When he was coming down from his surge of adrenaline, Witt parked his car near the King household. 2 hours after the phone calls started, when Witt had the opportunity to get back into his car and drive away, unseen, unnoticed, and not in trouble, he grabbed his knife and followed the trio of his friends back to the Schleipzig household. Premeditation means that the act was committed after reflection on the consequences by a cool mind. A cool mind that decided to put on camouflage so he wouldn't be seen, to hide the knife in the trunk of his car so base security wouldn't see it at the gate, to creep behind the foliage and observe his targets unseen. to follow them to a new location and find an unlocked door. The Witt court-martial ran for 6 months, from April through October 2005. Senior Airman Andrew Witt was convicted by a panel of 12 officers of the attempted premeditated murder of Senior Airman Jason King and the premeditated murders of Senior Airman Andrew Schleipzig and his wife, Jamie Schleipzig. Defense counsel retained a mitigation specialist whose job it was to collect any information, documents, or evidence that could help with the mitigation process. They collected thousands of pages of documents related to Andrew Witt and interviewed approximately 100 people with the intention to understand the crime and who Andrew Witt was. The mitigation argument, the argument that defense counsel put on in sentencing in order to try and avoid the death penalty, revolved around painting Witt as a man who was respectful, polite, nonviolent. That he was a good big brother raised in a protective religious home, that he lacked social skills but was active in sports and band during high school. The mitigation evidence portrayed Witt as a good human who showed some remorse for his actions, apologizing for what he did. But it offered no explanation as to why he packed his knife, drove to the base, and stabbed 3 people. Witt himself wrote, "My life has changed dramatically since that night, and I plan to continue to make changes. I want you to know that I am firmly resolved to lead a productive life in the service of others, and will not wander from this path if given the chance. Please allow me to live so that I can do this." He also noted that he regretted losing focus on the Air Force mission. He said, "I truly do love the Air Force, and I have been proud to wear this uniform. I understand my actions mean that I will never wear it again once the trial is over, and I am sorry for that as well." The mandatory minimum for his crimes was a life sentence, and prosecutors asked the panel to return with the death penalty. On October 13, 2005, the panel unanimously sentenced Andrew Witt to death. A clemency appeal asking to reduce his sentence to life in prison was denied. So no, outside this trial, Andrew Witt didn't get to wear the Air Force uniform he so loved and was so proud of. The Air Force uniform that he wore to murder his friends. For today's safety brief, it's just a reminder. Keep the grand finale on the 4th of July to fireworks. After the convening authority approved the findings of the court-martial and the sentence as adjudged, Witt appealed to the Air Force Court of Criminal Appeals. He raised 89 separate legal issues related to the findings of guilt, the sentence, the post-trial processing, and other miscellaneous alleged errors. Kudos to his appellate team on this incredible issue spotting. The Air Force Court of Criminal Appeals determined that Andrew Witt's defense counsel was constitutionally ineffective, having failed to investigate certain mitigating evidence. Therefore, in 2013, they affirmed the findings, the conviction, but set aside the death sentence and ordered a rehearing. The government moved for a reconsideration, which was granted. A new Air Force Court of Criminal Appeals panel held that defense counsel, while defective, did not prejudice Witt. They believed that even if the defense counsel pursued the potentially mitigating evidence that Witt raised, he still would have received the death penalty. This second panel approved both the findings, the conviction, and the sentence, the death penalty. There is still a significant procedural history to this case, but I'm going to pause us here to talk about the ineffective assistance of counsel claim. The Sixth Amendment guarantee to the right to counsel, which is incorporated into the Miranda warning, that you have the right to an attorney, isn't just a right to counsel, it's a right to competent counsel. Although I've heard many, many jokes about lawyers and ethics, we have strict ethical duties, and failure to meet these duties can result in being kicked out of the profession entirely. One of the tenets of legal ethics is that we cannot practice law that we are not competent in. To evaluate an ineffective assistance of counsel claim, courts apply the Strickland standard. The Strickland standard, which comes from the Strickland case, established that the Sixth Amendment entitles criminal defendants to the effective assistance of counsel. Legal representation cannot fall below what is reasonable in light of prevailing professional norms. But these ineffective assistance of counsel claims are evaluated from a space of strong deference to the defense attorney. There's a strong presumption that counsel was competent. The first Air Force Court of Criminal Appeals panel found that Witt's defense team failed to appropriately investigate and consider the effects of the motorcycle crash and the potential traumatic brain injury. The court found that failing to request additional brain imaging or interview witnesses regarding the crash and the changes in behavior fell below the standard of reasonably competent counsel. They believed the reasonable attorney would have investigated this issue further. They concluded similarly that a reasonable attorney would have investigated the family history of mental illness. Lastly, they concluded a reasonable attorney would have gotten the contact information for the sheriff's deputy that consoled Witt at his Article 32 hearing, the one who believed he was truly remorseful. This first Air Force Court of Criminal Appeals panel ordered everyone to redo the sentencing phase to make sure that Witt had effective counsel arguing against the death penalty. And as I briefly mentioned, government attorneys appealed this decision, and a second Air Force Court of Criminal Appeals panel found that although defense counsel offered ineffective assistance during the sentencing phase, it did not prejudice Andrew Witt. And there's some evidence to suggest that perhaps this counsel wasn't even ineffective. Defense counsel offered an explanation for not further pursuing the motorcycle accident claims. They believed that offering this motorcycle crash explanation was going to look like an excuse, and that they made a strategic decision not to make excuses to the sentencing panel. Nevertheless, when the Second Air Force Court of Criminal Appeals said that the ineffective assistance of counsel didn't prejudice Witt, they meant that the panel likely would have ordered the death penalty anyway. There had already been mitigating evidence presented. There were 22 character letters, 12 certificates of awards, 16 pages of photographs, and a 4-page unsworn statement from Witt himself. These documents, along with live witnesses, weren't enough to sway the panel members. The sheriff's deputy at the courthouse hugging him during his Article 32 hearing wasn't likely to change their minds. The overwhelming evidence of this case painted a picture of a cold, calculated, and vicious crime. So now there were two conflicting opinions issued by the Air Force Court of Criminal Appeals. The first ordered a resentencing. The second let the death penalty stand. The matter came before the Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces for resolution. In 2016, the Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces found that the Air Force Court of Criminal Appeals did have the authority to reconsider its own decision, but they nevertheless found an issue with the second panel's composition. Therefore, they went with the first panel and remanded the case for resentencing. At his sentencing rehearing in 2018, prosecutors again sought the death penalty for Witt. The sentencing rehearing took place over 35 days, spread over the course of a year and a half. His new sentencing defense counsel took heed of everything brought up in the multiple appeals to the Air Force Court of Criminal Appeals, and they presented evidence of a traumatic brain injury Witt experienced in the motorcycle accident. They also took time to show that Witt spent those 14 years on death row behaving. His family testified that he'd remained a central part of their lives, and that he regularly provided emotional support despite his incarceration. Witt himself expressed remorse at his second sentencing and apologized to the victims and their families. On July 6, 2018, 14 years after he murdered Andy and Jamie and nearly killed Senior Airman King, a panel of officers and enlisted members deliberated for 8 hours and returned to sentence Andrew Witt to confinement for life without eligibility for parole, dishonorable discharge, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, reduction to the grade of E1, and a reprimand. He escaped the death penalty for a second time. Witt appealed on a number of additional grounds, all of which were dismissed by the Air Force Court of Criminal Appeals in 2021. On June 6, 2023, So, last week, the Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces denied a further appeal and affirmed the sentence of life in prison without the possibility for parole. One dissenting judge suggested ordering a third sentencing proceeding amid allegations of prosecutorial misconduct in the sentencing rehearing. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it. I invite you to submit case suggestions and feedback to conductunbecomingpod@gmail.com. Join me next time when we balance this ineffective assistance of counsel claim with prosecutorial misconduct. Until then, take care. Conduct Unbecoming is a podcast where I get to talk about interesting crimes and cases that involve U.S. military service members. I research, write, and produce the podcast myself. The opinions expressed are my own, and perhaps it's obvious. Conduct Unbecoming is not approved, endorsed, or authorized by the Department of Defense.